the new empires that are forming out of these royal families. Okay, so industrialization causes people to expand. It causes countries to expand. The reach of the industrialization, the manufacturing and trading and all that extends out these countries that, if you will recall, are being very nationalistic now. Okay, so we walked them through the Enlightenment, we walked them through the Reformation, and then we brought in Romanticism, and then we brought in nationalism. So these countries that have decided that their identity is tied up in their country, like English nationalism or French nationalism, are also expanding out for all kinds of other reasons. Okay, at the apex of each of these countries is a monarchy or a ruling group that has its roots that go a long way back. But here's the weird thing about royal families. Family crests are valuable because they feel stable. They feel like something that's rooted deep and grows tall, okay, like a tree. But the truth of the matter is that a family tree withers if it doesn't expand. In order for a monarchy to be successful, it has to grow. It has to expand. They're either growing or they're shrinking. They're never just standing still. Okay, so we're going to take a look at some of the monarchies that are going to collide in the late part of the 1800s and the early part of the 1900s. We're going to look at some of these family trees today. I want to start with the Hohenzollern family. Hohenzollern family is a merchant family in the Holy Roman Empire. So let's talk about how the Holy Roman Empire works. Okay, so this is Central Europe. This is the Holy Roman Empire. And as you can see from this little map here, it is comprised of a gazillion tiny little kingdoms. Can y'all not hear me on Zoom?
I can.
Okay, good.
I can hear you.
So it's just Tiana.
I
Okay.
can hear you too.
Okay,
Yeah, me
good.
too.
Okay, I saw the chat and I was worried for a second. Okay, so the Holy Roman Empire is comprised of at one point, almost 200 tiny little countries. And each one of these tiny little countries has their own royal families, has their own kings. And the way that they choose who is the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire is through a system of electors. Okay, all of these little kingdoms, they have electors that represent them. And then those electors get together and they choose one ruler to be the Holy Roman Emperor. And then that ruler is usually anointed by the Pope, so that it's obvious that the Pope gives his blessing to this whoever this emperor is. It's usually a power struggle. It's often a popularity contest. Sometimes it has to do with which merchant family has the most power or which family has the most military behind it. But the candidates are often chosen, the candidates for who gets to be the Holy Roman Empire are often chosen from a limited number of families. The Hohenzollern family is one of the most powerful families in Prussia. Okay, so this up here, this is Prussia. And all I can tell you about Prussia without getting into really complicated details is that because of the geographical location of Prussia, it was always under attack. Okay, it's coastal, but it's plains. The geography does not provide any natural cover. And so Prussia learned early how to invest in their military. They learned very, very early that military discipline was the way they would survive. So Prussian military is a powerful thing. So the Hohenzollern family is a powerful merchant family in a country, in a kingdom where the military is the absolute strongest, okay? And they are expansionists, so they begin to eat other countries. They begin to spread out. They take over Brandenburg. They start to turn their sights on all these little countries over here, okay? Eventually, Prussia will be in control of all of this part of the Holy Roman Empire, okay? That's most of the north, and then they'll start attacking Austria and stuff. Prussia was very expansionist, okay? Actually, there were whole wars that you've heard of that were kicked off because people couldn't decide who was going to be the next Holy Roman Emperor. The French and Indian War was part of the 7 Years' War, was actually kicked off by a war of succession that had happened 30 years before that, over which of these two households was going, because the English thought it should be this one and the French thought it should be that one, and then they got in a fight with each other, and then they started fighting all over the world, including in America, where they allied with Native Americans. And that's where these wars come from, is because of this Holy Roman Emperor. Okay, so This Hohenzollern family was what was called a family of what we call Junkers. That's Junkers. It looks like Junkers, but it's Junkers. And that's aristocracy with land. And from those aristocratic roots, they're able to run massive trade empire and run massive trade outside of their country. And then they're able to put power in the hands of the people that are part of their household. So in 1871, after waves and waves and waves of different kinds of revolutions that swept across Europe, the Marxist uprisings that we talked about last week, the working class rising up and demanding more rights, constitutionalism sweeping across all these little countries. One of the things that they finally end up doing is uniting all of these great big chunks of kingdoms into one empire, which is called the German Empire. And in 1871, they chose an emperor for the German Empire who was Prussian. They chose the King of Prussia to be the emperor of all of the new German Empire. And the reason for that was because whoever was going to be in charge of the new German Empire was going to have to negotiate with the Prussian military to do it. So it was easier just to put the Prussian king in charge of the German Empire, put the military behind him, and then all of the Junkers from that area could just also take all the government positions, and it made it nice and neat into a nice, neat little package. Because of that, Austria didn't want to join. So Austria is not part of Germany. It's possible that if Austria had been better represented, that they might have wanted to be part of the German Empire. So in 1871, the King of Prussia was crowned the Emperor of the German Empire. And that's as far back as the German royal family goes. It only goes back to 1871, because in 1871, the German Emperor was chosen from the Prussian kingdom. His family roots might go back a lot further than that. It goes back to the Hohenzollerns. But his dynasty as the emperor is brand new. But it's precious to him. It's precious to all of Germany. He was chosen to be the first German emperor. He was crowned first Emperor Wilhelm I of the German Empire, and then he was only one of only 3 emperors of Germany that ever reigned, because Germany only ever had 3 emperors. Okay, and do I have that? I do somewhere. Anyway, okay, so let's move over to England. One of these German kingdoms was Hanover. Okay, I know I said let's move over to England and we're still in Germany. It's weird how that works. One of these little German kingdoms was Hanover. Okay, so I want you to take a look at this family tree here. This is the person that took over after Queen Elizabeth, James I. Okay, James I had Charles I, Charles I had Charles II and James II. And between here and here, there was a revolution and Charles II was beheaded. Okay, when they did reinstate the monarchy, certain parts of the royal family were cut off, okay? And so they had to go backwards up the family tree and find relatives that had been married off into other kings. And the place where a lot of English royalty was married off, younger siblings and sisters and daughters and nieces were married off, was into all these little tiny kingdoms in Germany. So in order to find who should take the throne next, they actually had to go over to Hanover, who was the and choose the heir to the throne of Hanover, because he was the descendant of the only part of the family tree that hadn't been cut out by the revolution, by the British Civil War. Does that make sense? Okay, so I like family trees because they're fun, but I also get lost in them sometimes because I'm like, okay, so this person was beheaded and his children. And so his brother took over, and then they didn't, where did they go? And then these people actually led an uprising and overthrew the monarchy and instituted parliament. And then they didn't have any kids, so they had to go back to his kid, but that kid had been married off. Sophia had been married off to the Elector of Hanover, and that's how we end up with a German on the throne of England. You follow all that?
Sort of.
Okay, what's interesting, one little interesting thing about this is the British accent that everybody fakes. Any of y'all good at faking a British accent? We do it in our house all the time. We play British accents all the time. The British accent you're used to faking, you see. is actually probably not the British accent that existed before Hanover began to influence. So, for example, Shakespeare was never done in this accent, ever, because this is a German accent.
No.
They,
Is it closer
Stay
to
with me.
Is it closer to Cockney?
yeah, the actual British accent that existed in like the time of Shakespeare was more like what they have in the North. All right, so more of the longer and the more heavier, it comes from the Vikings. You know, it comes up from the North and it comes down. And that's why if you read it in this accent, Shakespeare's lines actually rhyme. If you actually read to be or not to be in a Cockney accent, the words on at the end of each line rhyme. If you do it in this accent, they do not. And that's because this is a German accent.
No, you hear that in Austria a lot, don't you?
Huh?
You hear that accent in Austria a lot, don't you?
Austria has its own twang to it. And I'm not going to try an Austrian accent because I always end up sounding like Arnold Schwarzenegger, and that's not pretty. So I'm not going to do that. But go back and listen to it again. The early American accent is actually closer to what British actually sounded like than the English accent that you're used to hearing faked and that you're used to hearing in like Downton Abbey. Okay, that I'll be back. That accent, that's not how he said that. Yeah, because he was, well, actually, it probably is because he was Hanoverian. So you'll be back. That song, that's done with that flat kind of relaxed accent. That's actually a result of this influx of German royalty into the House of Hanover. So here's a family tree of the House of Hanover. George I marries this person. They have George II. They have 10 million children who all get married. Eventually, we end up with George III, who happens to be on the throne when America revolts. Okay, Mad George III, and he had a series of children, and eventually these children inherited the throne but didn't hold on to it for very long, and eventually the only child left of all of the sons of George III is Victoria. Okay, and Victoria takes the throne and rules. She's the second longest ruling queen. The first longest ruling queen is the one that's on the throne right now. So Queen Victoria receives the throne because her father dies young, and then her uncle has the throne, and then he dies, and then her other uncle takes the throne, and then he gets really sick, and before he dies, he makes sure to leave the lineage to her because he's worried otherwise that it will go in the wrong direction. Say again?
Is Victoria the one that they just made the movie about where she had a really close friendship with the Indian?
Yes. Yeah.
Played by Judi Dench.
Judi Dench always plays Queen Victoria. Yeah.
Wait, isn't she the original Pocahontas? Like in the Disney movie?
What?
You mean the second one where she goes and meets her? No, like when she.
If you're gonna start talking about Disney sequels, we're gonna get lost. Okay. So the dynasty that's sitting on the throne at the end of the 1800s actually has its roots a long way, but they're very tangled. The Stuart family runs out of viable heirs. They bring over an heir from Hanover, and now we have the House of Hanover. Victoria is going to change. So because she marries Prince Frederick, between the two of them, they institute what's called the House of Windsor. And that becomes the house that is still in existence today. It starts with Victoria and Frederick, and they become the beginning of the House of Windsor. So but Victoria and Frederick have a lot of kids, and we're going to talk about why that matters in a few minutes. The House of Romanov we actually talked about the other day, so we've covered that pretty thoroughly. The Romanov dynasty goes back all the way to this chief of the House of the Rus, this Rus chieftain, but really it takes its roots from like the Duchy of Moscow when it was Ivan the Terrible, but that's 1584. So we're talking about a dynasty in the late 1800s. It's 300 years old, a family that has passed down their dynasty from one generation to the next. But again, if it doesn't expand, it collapses. Dynasties are like that. Monarchies are like that. So we watched the other day, did we see this? Yeah. Ivan IV became the first Tsar of Russia when he united all of these duchies, and that became the House of Romanov. And the other day when we were talking about this, you saw that the Russian Empire expanded and expanded and expanded and expanded. So the House of Romanov is actually in control of a huge landmass, most of which is inside the Arctic Circle and is not very useful, but a lot of which is competitive with the empires of England and Germany, the new empires of England and Germany. So by the time we get to the Romanov family that's in existence at the beginning of World War I, this is a pretty straight line all the way from Catherine straight down. So this is Catherine the Great, married to Peter III, who lasted for 6 months on the throne before his wife overthrew him. And you can see that their direct lineage is very straightforward. Okay, so the person that's on the throne at the end of the 1800s and the early 1900s can tie back the roots all the way back to Catherine II. Okay, who, by the way, was from, does anybody remember? She was from one of those little German kingdoms. Yes. Brandenburg? No, but it did start with a B. I'd have to look it up again. But she was from one of those. She was Sophie. She was the princess of one of those little German kingdoms. So now we have German kingdoms in the House of Hanover in England, and we have Germans in the House of Romanov. And actually the most, arguably the strongest branch of the House of Romanov comes from Germany because it's Catherine. And there's some doubt about whether or not this guy actually was this guy's. So like there's some doubt, but it doesn't matter because bloodlines are, that's something you do when you're breeding animals. The point is that the dynasty that comes from this that is actually rooted also in Germany. Okay, so France.
She's from Prussia.
She was from Prussia?
Yeah, Pomeranian.
She was from one of the countries that Prussia ate.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's what it was. Thank you for looking that up.
Of all the Napoleons.
Okay, so all the Napoleons. Napoleon the First was not actually part of the royal family. I don't know if y'all remember our talk about Romanticism, but Napoleon the First actually took the imperial, like the laurel wreath, and had it put on his head by the Pope. But he himself actually was just a soldier who had climbed up the ranks. The actual French monarchy had been, well, beheaded. So there was a vacancy there. So he ascended the throne from his low ranking. So the monarchy in France doesn't have roots that go back very far at all. That's why it has to expand so fast. That's one of the reasons why it has to be expansionist. Because if a monarchy does not expand, it crumbles. He only actually managed to hold on to his rule for about 10 years, and then he did that little stint on the island of Elba, and then he came back for like a month or two, and then that was ended. The monarchy was restored after the French Empire had already lost most of its colonial holdings. And his nephew became the third, or his cousin, I guess it was his cousin. It was his nephew that became the second Napoleon, and then his cousin that became Napoleon III. So emerged as the new French emperor, self-declared in 1852, and tried to establish France's expansionist goals again, tried to regrow all of that. So you have this sort of ripple of France trying to expand outside of its borders and basically having its butt handed back to him by the Prussians, who put a stop to that. Okay, let's leave Germany for a little while and remind ourselves a little bit about what's going on in Japan. Now, we talked quite a bit about Emperor Meiji, or Meiji, I want to say it's Meiji, Emperor Meiji, and
The Meiji period is named after him, isn't it?
yeah, but I'm conditioned by my American upbringing that when I see a J in the middle of a word like that, I'm pretty sure it's pronounced like an H. That has nothing to do with Japan. That's because that's Spanish. Anyway, so the Japanese imperial family tree is the longest in the world. It's lasted over 2,000 years. You can actually draw a straight line from father to son to father to son to father to son to possibly a nephew here and there, but father to son or brother occasionally, all the way back 2,000 years. And the reason for that is largely because the emperor, for a very long time, handed a lot of his power over to his warlord. So If you tried to look at who was the shogun during this time, it would probably bounce all over the place. The family tree would be crazy. The person with the real power probably bounces all over the place, but the emperor is the figurehead. So they are able to maintain their power. They really literally have one job. Okay, so the family tree that Meiji is a part of takes its roots in 660 BC. Okay, the first ancestor that they can find that's part of that chain is from 660 BC. So actually, the Japanese royal family still exists. They gave up, they abdicated after World War II, but they still exist in Japanese culture, and they still exist as an acknowledged.
Both princesses are not the child who was married.
Yeah, they're like worse than the English as far as that goes. Okay, so we've got all of these empires all trying to kind of do the same thing. They're all trying to expand so that their monarchies can, can continue, so that their countries can continue. So, and there is something to be said for the idea that the figurehead of a country is actually a reflection of the health of the country. So if you have a strong, forward-thinking, active monarch, then chances are your country is also forward-thinking and active, or at least that's what people like to think. I think if you study history, you find out that's not actually true, but it is a myth that everybody really embraces very strongly. One of the things that these imperial forces are trying to do is establish themselves as the center of a kingdom that reaches around the world in some form or another. So we have cash crop colonies. We've talked about the mercantilism, pulling products from several different places to feed the mother country and then redistributing those products out from the mother country. Reaching across and establishing trade networks and establishing transportation networks and eventually communication networks, making it so that you can communicate with people that belong to your empire, even though they're really far away, over a really short distance. Product manufacturing and industrialization. England is bringing that to India. France is bringing that to Indochina. The kingdoms are trying to establish industrialization of various places, and then pulling from the indigenous people of those places labor in order to do those things. But the biggest thing that they try to do is shine the light of civilization. These advanced Western empires go into places like Africa and they shine the light of civilization. So here's a map that shows the holdings in 1800 by, I don't know, I suppose if you're colorblind, this map is not useful to you, but you can see all the red areas are areas where England has sovereignty, and they're scattered throughout. Here's Russia. Russia has this and this, basically. Spain is still exerting influence across this whole area in 1800, and Portugal has all of what is connected to Brazil and also several places in Africa and in India, and the occasional tiny little island in the middle of the Asian Sea. We also have expansion in the Netherlands in small places. The United States is its own like self-contained area. And then randomly we have the Ottoman Empire, which is Turkey. So that's 1800. This is as it expands. This is where Germany as an empire begins to exert its influence. Germany wasn't an empire before. So now we have a German empire in 1871. They begin trying to establish imperial holdings. They begin to try to take property in Africa because they have to take what's left, okay? They have to take the areas that are still left. This doesn't include China or Japan right now, this map doesn't. Okay, so here's where France tries to expand to in the new Napoleon III. This is where France tries to expand to. This is where Great Britain now has its holdings, or has its holdings at the end of the 1800s. And now we've got the United States spreading out and taking island holdings in various places. Okay.
Hey, Mindy, on the first map you showed, they're right there. I don't see the United States on there. Oh yeah, there it is. I'm sorry. There it is.
Yeah, it's
my mistake.
At that point, they're not quite an empire yet, so they're in 1800, they're not quite an empire yet. As you can see, they begin expanding into territories and possessions. This actually goes to the mid 1900s, so this is just kind of the direction that they're going. Okay, so that is, we see various attempts by these empires to demonstrate their reach, their global reach. One of the biggest ones, I think, is when during Queen Victoria's reign, they have what's called the Great Exhibition of 1851. They have to basically build a miniature city because in the 1850s, Queen Victoria took the title Empress of India. Because why not? You know, Empress of India, even though she never went there. As Eddie Izzard says, you never even went there. She took the title of she took the title of Empress of India in 1876 when the East India Company was dissolved. So we had that joint stock company that had its own military force of 60,000 troops and a whole fleet of ships that's gradually collapsing under its own weight through all of the 1800s. When it finally collapses in 1876, they no longer have this joint stock company managing all the trade, but they've got all these little miniature cities that Britain built in order to support that joint stock company. So in order to reinforce the idea that, by the way, Britain is still in charge of you just because we're not going to be sending the East India Company to you anymore, they gave Queen Victoria the title of Empress of India, okay? And so in order to reinforce this idea, they brought exhibitions from all over the places that are held by the British Empire and put them all in the same building. And it was like a miniature city. In London, you could go and visit the exhibition. Most people did. It was up, I think it was up for like 10 years, but you could go and visit it, and it was thousands and thousands of people went through to see the naked people from Africa and the snake charmers from India and all of the most stereotypical things, but also to see inventions that were being invented in the industrial, part of Britain and everything. It was a place where you could see the new machinery that was in all the factories, and some of it was actually very shocking because it was from tribal people, and there was a lot of culture clash. Okay, so Queen Victoria, Empress of India, we have her here riding on an elephant that's at the exhibition. That's not actually in India because she wouldn't actually have done that. Okay, and this is probably the story that you're talking about. The story of the Indian servant who came and befriended her. Yeah. It was her intention that England rule India by placing in control educated English-speaking Indians. So they elevate somebody and make them a Maharaja, and then make sure they're educated in all the English customs, and that way they manage to maintain their control while still letting local people rule.
So kind of like a figurehead.
More like a Udiscote. Have you ever heard of a Udiscote?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So it's the ruler that makes it okay for you to bow, because the ruler is one of you, but he caters to the tastes and cultures of the actual controlling power. Okay. So anyway, when America begins to actually get its feet under itself, as they expanded out west and as they managed the sea to shining sea thing, as they finished the Civil War and then managed to get Texas and California and add all the way up into Oregon and their entire thing, they realized that in order to compete, just like Japan, they realized that in order to compete, they're going to have to expand. So they begin actually trying to establish their own colonies, their own holdings in other parts of the world. Probably the biggest purveyor of this was Teddy Roosevelt, who was our ADHD president, I think. Probably one of the hyperest, most active details about visits with President Roosevelt included people being like, I couldn't figure out how to get out of the room, and he just kept bouncing from one subject to another. He was one of the most hyperactive presidents we've ever had. And he absolutely believed that America had a responsibility to bring its ideas, which were, the grand experiment of the Enlightenment, individualism, all of that kind of stuff, to bring these ideas to the dark places of the world and make them, because everybody was spreading to the dark places of the world. And most of what we're talking about here is Africa, but also the islands around in the Asian, in the Pacific, the islands in the Pacific, and in South America, places that he didn't consider, settled by people with the right ideals. That it was important that America strive to expand because it was good for American ego if they did. It meant that they were trying to be stronger and if they could hold out against all these other empires. So yeah, we're going to talk a lot about this on Thursday because we're going to talk about carving up Africa on Thursday. But I will say that by this time, all of these empires that are jostling with each other for growth are running out of places to grow to. They're running out of places that will allow them to grow. You can't expand into Asia because that's now, held largely by China. You can only expand into the outer edges of Asia before you start running into things that are basically already settled. China's already been settled with treaties that have robbed it of everything. So there's no point in colonizing. So basically the places that are left are like Australia and certain parts of South America and Africa. So if you want to establish yourself as a growing empire, this is the place that you do it. We're going to talk about that on Thursday, so I don't want to get too much into that. Japan decides that when they expand, they're going to expand into Korea, and that from Korea they will launch attacks into China, and that will be how their empire continues to expand. They form alliances when they do. They have conflicts and they form alliances. So they have conflicts with the Russians. They form alliances with Germany, who is they provide weapons to. They get weapons from. There's weapons trade going back and forth as Japan is trying to establish itself. When the Japanese begin their conquest, they follow a different set of rules than a lot of conquerors do. And you hear about that quite a bit. Between World War I and World War II, as they raid into Manchuria and establish their authority over coastal China, their campaign is really brutal. No, their campaign is really brutal. They, especially in Korea and in Nanking, the Japanese conquest is designed to dominate the region through terroristic violence. They want to make sure that the place they move into is not dependent on them for trade, that it is aware of their superiority of strength. So we have events in which, that those places still haven't recovered from, which we'll probably talk about between World War I and World War II. Okay, so this is the Congress of Berlin in 1878. And what you're seeing here, the rulers that you're seeing here are the leaders of France, Belgium, Denmark, Austria, England. Benjamin Disraeli of England is there. And they're negotiating over the future of the Ottoman Empire because the Ottoman Empire has collapsed, and they are deciding, because they are the representatives of each of the empires that still matters, what's going to happen to the land of the Ottoman Empire. And they have the power to do that because they are the expansionist empires. The Ottoman Empire is divided up into several smaller states. That's where we get Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, a couple of others. Yeah, all the Baltic states come from this this disintegration of the Ottoman Empire. So how long have we been battling the Ottoman Empire? Does anybody remember when we started talking about the Ottoman Empire? Yeah, it's been a standing force in the Western Mediterranean for a really long time, Eastern Mediterranean for a really long time. And when it falls, everybody gets to sit around and divide it up like cake, kind of the same way they did with China. So this Congress of Berlin divided up the spoils of the fall of the Ottoman Empire. Okay, I mentioned to you before that Wilhelm I was the one of only 3 emperors of Germany. Well, those 3 emperors all took the throne in the same year. Okay, Wilhelm I took the throne in 1871 and died in 1888. Okay, in 1888, his son took over while deathly ill. Okay, all right. So his son, his grandson, Wilhelm II, took over the throne in 1888, in June of 1888. Say what? Well, these are pictures of them as young men, though. This is not them in 1888. They're dead in 1888. That would be a different photograph.
It's gotta be a rough.
You're weird, Jordan. Anyway. Okay, so all three of the only German emperors that ever ruled the Empire of Germany took over during the same year. It was 1888. So Wilhelm I took over in March and then died, or took over in, he wasn't crowned in 1888. He ruled from 1871 to 1888, but he died in 1888. His son took over, deathly ill, and then his grandson took over. Incidentally, his grandson, Wilhelm II of Prussia, was married to Princess Victoria of England, the oldest child of Queen Victoria. Okay, she married him knowing that she married him before there was a German Empire, and married him knowing that she was going to take over as she was going to be the queen of the Prussian court, which was in and of itself like a really big deal. Very, very high pressure situation, worse than anything Marie Antoinette ever had to face. And then after she married into the family, her husband's grandfather was elevated to Emperor of Germany. And as he started to die, and as her husband's father started to die, she realized very quickly that no, I'm sorry. This is what happens when I don't look at my notes. This is her husband. This is her son. Okay, sorry about that. I just remembered. Okay, this is what happens when I don't look at my notes. As he became crowned Emperor of Germany, she realized very quickly that her husband would now end up Emperor of Germany. They had a son together, and their son had a crippled arm. Their son had a withered arm when he was born. It had something to do with something going wrong during the birth. And so Queen Victoria's favorite grandson became first in line to become the Emperor of Germany. Okay, you need a family tree? Will that help? Probably not.
Hey, Mindy,
Yes.
notice on those in that picture, all of them are wearing the Iron Cross. I'd be interested to know the history of that, because that came all the way through to Hitler. That was a big award.
Actually, it was an award that was given out during World War I too. The Iron Cross is actually a symbol of the military of Prussia. So that's one of the evidences that you have that the military foundation of the Empire of Germany is actually Prussian in its roots, which is one of the reasons why Germany shapes up the way it does. The German Empire is shaped by the Prussian ideology, which is very, very Lutheran, which means unfortunately very anti-Semitic, and also very militaristic and discipline centered.
Is that like Victoria's Cross?
No, Victoria's Cross is something else. But okay, anyway, so this is Victoria's grandson. This is Princess Vicky's son. This is Princess Vicky's husband. I'm sorry about that. I didn't mean to screw y'all up. So I just want you to take a look at this picture of all of the emperors that are in existence in the late 1800s.
That man has a fabulous bird hat.
That is this guy.
I like their suits, by the way. That little suit with the crest and everything.
Mhm.
That's very intriguing.
Yeah.
They all look the same.
Not only that, but these two right here are not brothers. They're actually cousins. They're actually not even that closely related, but they were so close. This is Tsar Alexander II, Tsar Nicholas II, excuse me. Let me make sure I have that right because my brain is starting to misfire. And this is Victoria's son, George. Okay?
You said that that's like you were about to say they were life partners, and I got very excited.
They were roommates. No, they were extremely close. This person ends up married to one of Victoria's daughters. Okay, so this is one of Victoria's sons-in-law. This person is, and I'm looking at them now and I'm like, do I have that backwards? No, that's not backwards. Well, they dressed like each other on purpose. They compared fashion notes on purpose. You remember that Russia had to go through that whole beard tax thing in order to look Western. They had to go through these whole phases. Well, the Tsar of Russia is now trying to look like the King of England on purpose because he likes the fashion. So they actually tried to twinsy on purpose. And he tried really hard to join them and they wouldn't let him.
Hey, Mindy,
Yeah.
the Roman, that bird hat is the Roman Legion. They used to carry those in front of the troops.
It's possible. The bird is also symbolic in Prussian history too, so it's probably also has to do with reference. And then you have the Emperor Meiji over here also cutting his hair and growing the beard and having the uniform and everything. So these are all people that are in power at the end of the 1800s and early 1900s. Here's their family tree of these three men specifically, okay? So Kaiser Wilhelm II, who's the German emperor, is the son of Victoria of England, who's the grandson of Queen Victoria, okay? Queen Victoria's son, Edward VII, Edward VII is the father of King George V, okay? So these are both grandsons of Queen Victoria, okay? Tsar Nicholas II is the child of Tsar Alexander III. And if you go up far enough here, you end up here. Württemberg, but yeah, that's Catherine the Great, obviously. And if you go this way, you end up with his wife, who is actually the daughter of, his wife isn't on here. His wife is actually one of Victoria's grandchildren. So these are three of the descendants through marriage in Russia, but the other two, they're all grandchildren of Victoria. So, well, not just that, but you have to recognize that when we get into World War I, these people are going to take up arms against each other. They're all descended from the same family tree. They're literally grandsons of the same woman, or married to a granddaughter of the same woman. They're all part of the same. They're all part of the same Thanksgiving dinner. Okay. So we're going to get into this a little bit more next week when we start to actually talk about this. But I wanted you to go ahead and have this on your mind, that all of these empires, as they expand, they begin to overlap with each other. It is important that as you expand, you also form alliances. There are two ways that you can gain power as an empire. One of them is to expand, and the other is to ally, okay? If you can directly affect the future of another empire, then you are actually part of the power structure of that empire. So we'll talk about these alliances, but these are the empires that exist and how they are tangled up with each other. This is the best possible drawing you can get of how those alliances work, because otherwise there's no chart. You can't make a chart. You can't draw lines because they're just so complicated and overlapping with each other. And then that sort of leads to the mania, which leads to World War I. And mania is a mnemonic device: militarism, alliances, nationalism, imperialism, and then assassination.
Wow.
Okay, so I wanted to put that in your consciousness, I guess. I actually don't have any idea what time it is.
I know.
Usually after this, I have a slide that shows the execution of the Franz Ferdinand, but I want to talk about Africa before we get into that, and then we'll have time next week. All right, so that was a lot of ground to cover, but I think it's important that we understand that as we start to collide these empires together, that there are actually families, you know, that are trying to expand their regimes in the midst of all of this.